Let's get some international news now, and off to the USA we go. The Democrats there blaming President Donald Trump for stoking violence in Portland over the weekend. Things came to a boil after a series of tweets from Donald Trump, his supporters clashing with Black Lives Matter protesters who have marched against racism in the city of Portland since the killing of George Floyd 3 months ago. Now, a man was shot dead on Saturday in those clashes, and our US correspondent Simon Marks has more. Good evening to you, Simon. Just talk to us about what happened on Saturday, the tweets from Donald Trump, and how the politicians are responding to this death.
Absolutely. So what happened on Saturday was that Portland was once again a flashpoint for violence, but this time it wasn't between Black Lives Matter protesters and authorities trying to bring the city back under control. It was between Black Lives Matter protesters and a group of President Trump supporters, hundreds of them, who descended on the city in a convoy of cars and trucks, saying that they were absolutely determined not only to hold a rally in the city, but then to exercise their freedom to drive through the centre of the town. And it was in that latter stage of that demonstration, as they drove their cars and trucks through the city, that they clashed with Black Lives Matter's protesters, firing paintballs at the protesters, and also in some cases there were reports of them firing pepper spray at those protesters. Somewhere in the middle of all of that, there was a shooting, and a prominent member of a Christian conservative right-wing organisation that had been sending supporters onto the streets of Portland many times over the course of the last few weeks in a bid to show support for President Trump was shot to death. We still don't know who fired the fatal bullet, but certainly President Trump has been heading to Twitter to pay tribute to the dead man in Portland, whose name has not yet officially been released by the authorities. The stage is set here, Sally, for a major standoff now between Donald Trump and Joe Biden over violence on the streets of American cities. President Trump says that all of these cities, Portland in Oregon, Chicago, Minneapolis, last week Kenosha in Wisconsin, they're all Democrat-run, and the violence that you're witnessing on these city streets is merely a portent of what is to come all over the country if Joe Biden secures the keys to the Oval Office. The Democrats say, hang on a second, this is all happening on Donald Trump's watch. He has created an atmosphere of hate, resentment, and these standoffs in these cities. And Joe Biden right now is on a plane flying to Pittsburgh, where he's going to make a speech in about 45 minutes' time. And he's going to ask Americans, do you feel safe in Donald Trump's America? And that phrase, Donald Trump's America, is key to what Democrats hope is the beginning of a successful pushback against the claim that all of this is happening in Democrat-run cities. So a stark choice being presented to the public by the two candidates for the presidency now.
So we've got just over 2 months before the election. Of course, last week we saw the Republican National Convention, the week before the Democrats. Both were televised, both were sort of virtual events. Which one got the better ratings?
Well, stop me when this becomes familiar, Sally, but the country is in the grip once again of an argument about crowd size, because the ratings agencies that monitor the size of the television audience say it's absolutely clear the Democrats had a bigger audience all week long than the Republicans. And if you look at the numbers for President Trump's speech last Thursday night, around 23.8 million people watched that speech, compared to 24.6 million people who watched Joe Biden's speech the week earlier. In other words, more people watched Joe Biden's speech than watched Donald Trump's. That, of course, is not a narrative that is acceptable to the current occupant of the Oval Office, who always pushes back when anyone dares suggest that he wasn't topping the ratings and wasn't pulling the numbers. So over the weekend, he claimed that if you look at the online audience, and his argument is that his supporters are more likely to watch his convention online than Donald Trump, than Joe Biden's supporters were to watch the Democrat convention online. Then Donald Trump is claiming that almost 180 million Americans watched his convention. In other words, half the country, over half the country, he says, watched his convention. I mean, by any stretch, that is not a defendable claim to maintain, and certainly flies in the face of decades of audience gathering that has taken place on the country's television networks. But Donald Trump very keen to push back against the idea that he wasn't winning a big audience with his speech last Thursday night. The bigger problem for Donald Trump, though, is contained in the most recent opinion polls that show he would never mind the audience. He hasn't enjoyed any bounce in the polls coming out of that Republican National Convention. And, of course, he needed that bounce in the polls to help revive his flagging fortunes.
Of course, polls have been wrong before. Let's not forget that as well. Simon Marks in Washington, thank you very much for your time this evening.